Welcome to the Non-Obvious Insights Show. I'm your host, Rohit Bhargava, and every week I go through hundreds of news sources to curate the most interesting and underappreciated stories that you might have missed. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll talk about how to conquer Zoom fatigue, how Afrofuturism offers a new way to see the world, why fake news might not actually be fake, and the disturbing creation of psychopathic AI. In addition, we'll discuss the significance of Hulu's new self-service ad platform for small businesses, the reality of cancel culture, why the slow death of Quibi is irresistible to watch for some, and the most expensive retro video game ever sold. All that and another segment of my non-obvious double take story of the week that should get you to think twice, and my selection for the non-obvious book release of the week are coming in just a few seconds. We're live streaming to Facebook, YouTube, and Periscope, and the show starts right now. Happy Thursday, Non-Obvious Nation. We're back for another edition of the Non-Obvious Insights Show, and I have some great stories to share with you this week. You know, last week was a little bit crazy with our book summit, and I collected stories, but it was tough. It was tough to manage everything, and so I had a little bit of a backlog. And I think I got a little bit too ambitious, perhaps, this week, because I've got a ton of stories to share with you. But I'm very excited about them. So let's get going with the first one, which is all about Afrofuturism. And this was a term that I hadn't actually heard before. And I spent a lot of time thinking about the future. And this article about it from Wired Magazine got me thinking because of a couple of quotes from it. And I just wanted to share with you two of the quotes. And one of them was that futurists ask what tomorrow's hoverboards and flying cars are made of. Afrofuturists ask who will build them. And does their commercial use fall out of their utility in military or law enforcement? And futurists labor over questions about the nature of android consciousness. Afrofuturists ask how race might be wired into android consciousness. And you know, this whole topic of just blind spots was brought to life for me through this article, because when we think about the what of what's coming next, it's really interesting. But sometimes we forget like who is coming along with that and what biases are built into that. And when you start thinking about like algorithmic bias and whether the technology that's being created is evenly going to look at everyone. And I've got a couple other stories about sort of future technology in this week's show. It really causes you to remember that if we don't have a wide, diverse group of people creating the technology in the first place, it's not going to serve everybody. And this article was a great reminder of that. So that's the first topic that really interested me, and one that I wanted to share with you. And the next story is a little bit more about the moment that we find ourselves in right now, in this term that I'm hearing more and more, which is Zoom fatigue. And there's just been a bunch of new developments to try and help address some of this. So Zoom launched a piece of hardware for $600 that basically has all the cameras and microphones built into the monitor. And so you can buy the hardware, and it's just for Zoom conferences. PC sales have been rocketing and just continuing to grow. And there was this really cool new platform that I was introduced to last week called Mmhmm. That's the actual name of the platform. And there's a very funny demo video of it done by one of the founders, where he jokingly says that they named it Mmhmm because he believes that the name of a company should be something that you can say with your mouth full. And so Mmhmm kind of fit that. But the funny thing about this this video app is it allows you to do some pretty cool stuff. So you can ghost yourself and kind of have your slides behind you. You can shrink yourself and make yourself larger. And it's just in limited beta right now, and it's just for people with Apple computers, which doesn't describe me. So I won't be able to test it yet, unfortunately. But it's a pretty cool looking tool to try and do one of the big things that I think many of us are trying to do, which is make this format, presenting to camera, going on Zoom calls, just a little bit more fun and interesting. And there were a couple of other stories that related to this. So Microsoft launched a feature called Together, which is what this GIF that you see moving on the screen illustrates, where you sort of remove the surroundings and you put people with the same backgrounds so it feels more like they're in the same room. And there was another guy who created this AI tool that is like a bot that attends meetings for you. And it was sort of creepy. And there was another video about that. But like all of these stories relate to this idea that we're becoming tired with the standard typical Zoom meeting. And so we're hungry for something else. And I think we're going to continue to see more of those types of innovations. And you know what? Like one of the biggest innovations, and I put air quotes around that word, that I've seen people do, is go back to phone calls. I mean, how nice is it to just have a phone conference where you don't have to be on video and you can just talk to each other with voice? That's become really appealing now, just as a way of saying, look, I don't want to be on video all day. Like, it's just exhausting to do that. And I think that we're going to see more and more of those types of examples. And these were just a couple of stories that were sort of indicating that. Another big topic that I look at every week is fake news. And we talk a lot, I think, in our culture about fake news. And many of you know, who've been paying attention to this show for a long time or reading my email for a long time, I read all different types of news sources. And I read Fox News, and I'm subscribed to a lot of the stories from Fox News. And I don't really agree with a lot of what I see out there, but I started to identify this pattern that I've been tracking really over the last couple of weeks. But this past week, I created a graphic that I shared in my email. And if you're watching the show on video, you're looking at that graphic now. And what you see here is a bunch of different headlines. And all of the headlines have something in common, which is they all start with someone who said something. So Chris Pratt's wife, Katherine Schwarzenegger, says, or Dan Bongino says, or Bill, I don't even know who some of these people are, but they're reporting on what people said. And there's two things that become clear when you start to look at that. The first is that it's not fake. I mean, these people actually said this, and they're reporting on what they said. So when you accuse a news service of being fake, it's easy for them to come back and say, look, this isn't fake. We're not making this stuff up. People said this. The problem is that they're putting opinions right next to facts, and they become indistinguishable from one another. And so to me, like, the real challenge that seems to be emerging from this is what's significant and what isn't, who is significant and who isn't. And the more we start reading media and paying attention to media that is reporting on what insignificant people said as if it's news or even breaking news, the more confusing it gets. And so one of the things that I've started doing, just in terms of my media habits, is I've been really looking at any story that starts with so and so said something. I don't put a lot of weight into articles like that, no matter where I read them, whether it's on Fox News or somewhere else, because all they're reporting on is what somebody said. And this he said, she said style of reporting is really distant from what's actually happening in many cases. And so I just try and avoid that altogether. And I thought that was one of the things to just bring up as I consistently talk every week about the importance of changing our media diet and paying attention to things that we don't necessarily agree with, and becoming more educated because we get smarter about what to pay attention to and what not to pay attention to. I mean, this is a skill that we all have to get better at, and that we have to help one another get better at. And especially with our kids, I mean, this is such an important skill to be able to be literate about the media. I believe in that really strongly. And I think this was just one more example of why it's so important. On the more lighthearted side, there was a story this week that the country of Barbados has offered a incentive for people to move there and work remotely. And on the surface, this may not seem all that non-obvious. I mean, great, another Caribbean destination says, hey, come on over and you can get Wi-Fi and just work from here. But what's interesting, I think, is that I'm seeing more and more people it's not as risky as it may once have seemed. That type of lifestyle and just going off and living that way was always something that people who had that type of work that could be done remotely could do. But not everybody did it because it seemed like this drastic, extreme thing to do that only certain people who wanted a certain lifestyle would do. And now, with quarantine and with the fact that we don't actually meet with people all that often, and the challenges that are happening here in the US, at least in terms of cases going up and it becoming more dangerous, I see the appeal of this much more. But more importantly, I see this as being less risky for people to do. And I think the result of that is that A, more people will do it, and B, you'll see more destinations that can offer better climate, live on the beach, that type of lifestyle, saying, "Hey, come on over to us too." And I'm not sure if it'll become a wave of people, but it's definitely something to watch in terms of whether people will be based in some of these places and whether they'll increasingly move there as well. So just something I'm keeping my eye on, and I think it would be worth it for you to maybe keep your eye on it as well. There's another story this week about what the article that I read called Psychopathic AI. And this sounds exactly as dangerous as it probably could be, which is a team of researchers at the MIT Media Lab basically took AI and trained it to see the world based on a certain set of images. And the images that they took were the worst images they could find online, images from horror films. And they trained the AI to see the world based on these images. And then they did some Rorschach ink blot tests to test what the machine saw. And all of the responses came back as like, man murdering somebody, or like somebody lying on the side of the road dying, like all of these like really negative responses. And so what they essentially showed is that AI can be trained to be and think in more psychopathic ways, which on the surface, the first question is, why would you ever want to try and teach AI to do that? Like that's just seems like a bad idea overall. But I think the other piece of that is, now that we know that, maybe we can prevent it, or at least get better at making sure that that doesn't happen, because all the sci-fi scenarios that show like AI taking over, they're based on something like this. And so if we can understand it, maybe we can prevent it. So hopefully that's what happens, and not the other thing, the negative thing. So we'll see, but hopefully that's the way that it goes. Another story that I thought was kind of cool was this idea of changing the packaging based on sustainability. And one of the stories that I saw this week was from Diageo, and it was all about Johnny Walker, their brand Johnny Walker, and introducing the first paper whiskey bottle. And that was just kind of cool looking. I mean, I liked the way that it looked. I liked the idea behind it. And Diageo is a huge brand, and so if they can get enough momentum and attention behind this, maybe they'll start rolling it out across other things. And I also just thought it was kind of fascinating that they could do this with whiskey. So I thought I should do my part and just publicize it and help it get out there, because I think it's a great thing. I mean, if more brands that have packaging start to do something like this, I think that's just a good thing for the world. So just a quick reminder, if you're enjoying these stories, if you're enjoying listening to all of these ideas, then you should definitely subscribe to my email newsletter. And the email newsletter is sent every Thursday, and it includes these stories that I just shared, and a link to this video broadcast, and this podcast that you're either listening to or watching, where I talk about even more stories. So definitely subscribe to that and be part of our group over there, be part of the community over there. And let's keep rolling, because I mentioned I have a lot of stories that I want to share with you this week. And so I want to keep it moving super fast. And the next one that I wanted to talk about was the non-obvious double take story of the week. And that's a special feature that I've been starting to do over the last couple weeks. And it's essentially a story that just got me thinking twice. And I think that's important to do with some stories, to not just take them on the surface, but actually see like, well, okay, what does this actually say to me? And this story was from Adweek, and it was about our cancel culture. And cancel culture is sort of this broad term that I think is being applied to the idea that we are afraid to take a stand. And so we just, we just cancel something, or we are taking so much of a stand to an extreme extent that we're perhaps leaning too far towards being politically correct, and not actually standing for something that is well thought out. And there's a big debate, I think, happening about that. Like, how far should we go? Should we censor who gets to speak on college campuses, for example, or should we allow them to talk and just not show up? Isn't that better? And, I have my own points of view about this, but what I thought was worth thinking about and challenging perhaps what I think and maybe what you think about this topic as well was the fact that more and more we have the chance to make a statement with what we do. And part of it is what we buy. And what this article was really about, because it was from Adweek, so it's about kind of retail and advertising and marketing. And what this story talked about is it's fine to vote with your wallet. It's fine to choose to make a statement based on what you understand about the world, because you know what, like that's your chance to do something. And by do something, what that means is make a choice based on where you spend. And I think we saw a huge example of this with Facebook and all of the different companies that have been boycotting Facebook because they just don't believe that Facebook is doing enough to beat hate and misinformation on their platform. And I think that's true. And I think that's a great thing that now finally they're starting to look at it because the dollars started getting pulled away. And sometimes I think that is the most effective way to try and make that change. And so I just thought like that's a story that's going to continue to be out there. That's going to be a debate that people will continue to have. And it's just something that I think we should keep talking about and keep thinking about. The next story that I wanted to share, and this one's kind of a hopeful one, I think, because I started thinking about this just in terms of my own media behavior. Like Hulu is offering streaming for advertising for small businesses now. So now, like if you have your own business, you could create a video ad and then stream it onto Hulu and be right up alongside big advertisers who are doing media buys and putting ads into some of the favorite shows that people watch. And the more opportunities like this there are, I think the more creative anybody who has a small business is going to have to get in terms of being able to do some of this marketing and put it out there and make it really interesting for people and to connect with more people. And I just think that's going to be a really great opportunity for all of us. Another story that this one was sort of related. Sometimes these stories are related to something that I just saw in my own life. And there was a story this week about an Indian royal family that gets to keep control of a temple and how much money is coming through like from that temple. And it made me think of these two movies that my wife and I just happened to watch over the last couple of weeks that are both Bollywood films. And both of them have this theme where they're talking about how when you are getting your religion through someone who is sort of the intermediary, right, between you and your religion and God, that person is profiting in sometimes unfair ways. And the theme of both of these movies, which the story kind of made me think of, is why do we need these middlemen? Why don't we have our faith and have our faith directly with God? And why do we have to pay these middlemen in order to be able to be religious? And this is a huge topic that's happening, I think, in India, but in many other places as well, where people are starting to question, like, we want community, we want faith, we want religion in many cases, but we don't want these people who are buying private jets because they're profiting off of the money that we're trying to spend on something that we believe. And the more they're able to sort of get away with that and make billions and billions of dollars or rupees or whatever the currency is, the harder it becomes for us to separate faith from business. And that's one of the big topics that these movies talk about and that this story made me think of. And it's a really a big non-obvious idea. I think I would love to see more about that. I would love to read more and watch more about that. I just think it would be a really interesting thing. And these are two movies which, if you have, I think they're on either Netflix or Amazon, or if you have any of those streaming platforms, like you can watch these movies right now, and they all have subtitles, so you don't have to speak Hindi or anything. But they're great great movies. One is OMG, oh my god. The other one is PK, and they're both really great films. So highly recommend those. And big topic there. Another topic that came out in the news this week was from the Columbia Journalism Review that was talking about this topic of secondary trauma. And there's been more studies and court cases on this idea that the people who are seeing traumatic stuff in social media are suffering because of it. And one of the things I've talked about in the past is like these moderators who have to watch the things that none of us want to watch, of people actually getting killed and in footage and just like really, really disturbing stuff. There's moderators who have to watch that and then kind of prevent that from going onto social media. And those are humans. And the more those humans have to witness that type of content, the more emotional trauma they experience. And what the court ruling said, which is I think a really, really good thing, is it said the companies that are hiring these moderators are liable to help pay for some of these, some of the treatment that they're going to need. But it was just this really disturbing story also because when we have access to all of these things, and what this article talks about is previously when a story like this would happen, or we had like war footage, it was someone's job in the media, in the newsroom, to edit out the really gory stuff because you didn't want to show that on television. And now it's just presented directly to us. There's no filtering of that. And you could say, well, that's great because we see the real story. But the downside of that is that we get access to this really violent, gruesome content that can be very, very disturbing, and especially if it's accessible by younger people. And so it's something that we're going to have to continue to deal with. And as the ease of creating content and posting it online becomes more and more, we're going to have to balance the fact that we want some of this content to come out because it shows the truth, right? It shows what's actually happening, and maybe it can start to create political change. But on the same time, like, we don't want it to be so disturbing that we can't forget it. And now all of a sudden, like, it changes the way that we see the world. So this was one of those stories that kind of talked about both of those things. Another story, and this was more about a failure of a platform, Quibi, which many of you know is a platform that had short form content. So they had like 30-second episodes or like a couple minute episodes of shows. And they had a ton of celebrities behind this thing, and a lot of support from really, really rich, well renowned people in the world of entertainment. And it's failing. And this story was kind of about how sometimes there's a little bit of joy that the world experiences by watching a failure like this. And the word for it is Schadenfreude, right? And it's a apt word for describing this feeling. But what this article made me think of is that sometimes we want moments like that because it just makes us feel a little better about the stuff that we're doing, or maybe something that we're working on is failing. But hey, like really, really rich billionaires who launch something that should be awesome and isn't, they fail too. And so it just kind of makes us all feel better. And I thought, like, that's okay. Like, let's look at something that fails. And look, nobody died, nobody got seriously hurt. Most of the people who were involved in this, like, they have enough money to recover from it. So I mean, who's the real victim in a platform like this failing, right? Maybe some people who lose their jobs and then have to go and find something different. That's, it's always the little guys, right, who get hurt. But it's a challenge. Yeah. Another story that I started reading this week, and it really stuck out for me only because I am in the midst of watching Star Trek Discovery on CBS All Access, and I'm nearly done with it. And so one of the things that this article talks about is that there's a sexist legacy of women and how women have been portrayed in Star Trek. And it's a really good in-depth article about that, but it also has this empowering side because it talks about how in many cases, particularly with some of the newer shows, so Star Trek Picard, Star Trek Discovery, women have been taking a prime role, a leading role, and really dominating in many ways those shows. And it just shows the shift between the 1960s and the original Star Trek, and now what's coming to be sort of the actual next generation of Star Trek. And anybody who's a Trekkie or just interested in the evolution of how women have been portrayed in media and entertainment, I think this is a great article to read. It was from Gizmodo, and it's just, I highly recommend it. It really was a fun read, not only because I'm a Trekkie, but because it was just interesting historically. Another article this week talked about influencers, and that in many cases, what we're seeing is more and more influencers are creating live streams and monetizing those live streams. And Amazon's been particularly aggressive with this. And if you think about just how many people buy things on Amazon, and that their influencer program, which they've had for some time, is now opening up to live streaming, you can see the huge potential for many of these content creators who've built these vast audiences doing things like sort of creating content of unboxing of toys or any category you could imagine, like reviewing tech gadgets. Those people being able to do live streams and then put those live streams onto Amazon, it's huge. And it's going to drive a ton of revenue. And when they're getting commission revenue, it's going to drive a ton of revenue from them. So that's one of those things that I think we all are going to have to watch. But particularly if you're marketing something, if you're putting a product out there, to know that these influencers are creating these live streams, I mean, that's a big deal. That's a big thing to watch. Another story this week that got me shopping and thinking about spending money was the design school, the graduate design school at Harvard, deciding that they're going to do a fundraiser by going out to their alumni and asking them for design items that they have to put up for auction. And just going through some of these things, there were just some really interesting, fun, beautiful pieces of art. And so if you're looking for getting some of those things for not huge amounts of money, so many of the things were much cheaper than some of the like Basel Art Fair and stuff like that I've talked about in the past, which is like way out of any, well, my price range, definitely, but like maybe other people too. This was, $30, $50. So much more affordable, really interesting stuff, definitely worth checking out. And by the way, all of the articles that I'm talking about in the show notes for this show will have the links to every article. So you can click on any of them and you can easily find them and go and check them out. Finally, before we get to the non-obvious book release of the week, I wanted to share something that kind of made me feel bad for not being a hoarder myself, which is the most expensive retro game sold at auction, which was a sealed copy of Super Mario Brothers that sold at auction for $114,000, which is a new record for the sale. And what was sort of disturbing about this was that apparently the value of a sealed copy of Super Mario Brothers goes dramatically up when you have a hang tab or like a specific cardboard behind it. And so it's like a super nuance for super collectors, but it made me think, man, I should have bought an extra one of those games. I mean, I played this game when I was a kid. Like, what if I bought an extra one of those and just saved it? Like, how cool would that have been? So anyway, missed opportunity there. But the final story of the week is the non-obvious book release of the week. And I think it has to be the one that's rocketed to #1 on Amazon all week. People have been talking about it in the media. And it is the expose book from Donald Trump's niece, Mary Trump, talking about the Trump family. And the reason why I wanted to bring this up was not so much to get into the politics of it, but to introduce a question that I started thinking about as I started reading this book. And it was that the family that Trump came from, and specifically his father, in many ways was pretty abusive in terms of neglect and emotional abuse. And that's kind of what this book talks about, the dysfunction of the family. And what I started thinking about as I was reading that was, does that make me feel differently about the president, knowing that as a child he had to go through all of this stuff? And maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I mean, there's like, we had a big debate with some of us where it's like, look, he's 70 plus years old. Like, if you're at some point you have to grow up, right? I mean, that's one perspective. The other perspective is, well, these leave lifelong scars, and if you never talk about it, right, if you never go to any sort of emotional counseling or anything like that, then you're stuck with these scars, and it colors who you are. It makes you into a more insecure person. It makes you into somebody who never feels like they're good enough. And that's kind of what this book awakened for me, which is the backstory behind why he, at least, is the way he is. And I think it's easy to react to right now. It's easy to react to like what's happening in the moment, but to think about it in that way, that's sort of a different way of thinking about it. And that's what this book did for me. So, definitely recommend this book. And finally, I just wanted to say, kind of as a closing, that every week I'm sharing the most interesting stories of the week, and I hope that these are valuable for you. I hope you join me in this every week. And if you want to get the email, make sure you subscribe at nonobvious.com/subscribe. And you can watch this on YouTube or Facebook every week. So thanks for joining me. Thanks for being part of this, and have a great non-obvious week to come.